Well, good morning, everybody. Bom dia, feliz ano novo. I wanted just to take a very short minute to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council. I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America program. We've had a really busy first year of operations and have loved every minute of working to try to be the new kid in the neighborhood, the new voice in town, and we've tried to be a little bit of a different voice. And it was a good timing to create a Latin America Center because there's a newfound interest in the region on the part of many stakeholders. And indeed, in the last 3 months, the United States government has taken a decisively committed approach to Latin America. Now, who knows if that's going to last, but it certainly is fun to watch. And Washington seems to be finally realizing and understanding what the US business community, what NGOs, and the many citizens of Latino origin have known for a while, that Latin America is a region of 585 million Westerners who over the past decade have largely undergone an impressive political, economic, and social transformation that signifies large-scale economic, geopolitical, and cultural opportunities for us all together in the Western Hemisphere. And nowhere in the region are those possibilities and challenges larger than in Brazil. We're delighted to have our first event of 2015 center on Brazil, a country with which I have huge personal affection and which we Americans share much history, culture, and outlook, even though far too often it looks like we stand with our backs to each other. Today's event, Advancing the U.S.-Brazil Agenda for 2015 and Beyond, is intended to set the stage for our center's continuing work in Brazil. We're delighted to be partnering in this event with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council. The Brazil-U.S. Business Council and Paulo Sotero's Brazil Center at the Wilson Center have long been the institutions that have given voice to Brazil's aspirations and desires in Washington and Brazil's reality in Washington. So we here at the Adrienne Arsht Center are really glad to join that chorus. I'm happy to introduce Ambassador Anthony Harrington from the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, who will give a few opening remarks. In addition to being Chair Emeritus for the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, Ambassador Harrington is also Chair of the Managing Board and Head of the Brazil and Latin America practice at Albright Stonebridge. We know him best for the time that he served as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil from 1999 to 2001, having been nominated and confirmed by the U.S. Senate with a bipartisan support in a record 12 days. That stuff just doesn't happen anymore. He served during a time of unprecedented bilateral engagement, a time we hope comes back, between the two countries, and as ambassador, he worked closely with both U.S. and Brazilian companies to strengthen business and economic ties. Following the ambassador's remarks, Jason Marczak, the center's deputy director, and at my left, will introduce our panel of experts, and he will captain today's event. So thank you all for being here. Tony?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for braving the weather, which didn't require so much bravery after all. I've got my pocket watch out here since my wife is not here to do this to me this morning. But first, thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center for hosting this important and very timely event. As well as the Brazil-U.S. Business Council as co-host. As Peter mentioned, I had the good fortune to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, and it happened to be a time of really a high point in our relationship, enough to get me committed to a second country so that I continue to work actively in the private sector to advance the bilateral relationship. Other roles, as Peter mentioned, as well. I know our very distinguished group of panelists will discuss challenges and opportunities as Peter mentioned in greater depth, but I'll set the stage maybe with just a few of my own observations. And I just noticed Kasia Carvalho, the director of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, has joined us. Thank you, Kasia. Obviously, the distractions of the last 18 months have been disappointing for those of us who work to advance this bilateral relationship. Before I went to Brazil, a former assistant secretary for the hemisphere said that Brazil was the black hole of American diplomacy. And I realized how insufficient the knowledge and engagement was our knowledge and engagement in this country. That has surely changed for the better, even if it's had some bumps in the road. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can turn the page again in 2015 and begin to regain the momentum we saw at the beginning of President Rousseff's administration, commencing with the unprecedented early visit of President Obama. I see evidence and hear evidence of a will in both administrations in Brasilia and here in Washington to re-engage in a meaningful way. Vice President Biden's participation in the inauguration was the highest level for an inauguration in decades and continues to build on a very strong personal relationship he has developed with President Rousseff. They're not exactly the same personalities, as those of you who know both, but Vice President Biden is a very winning personality. I remember that President Rousseff was asked what she admired about President Obama, and she said he has very good taste in vice presidents. By the way, the visit during the inauguration, it wasn't, never know what's going to happen. There was a 30-minute visit which she indicated publicly would occur the day before inauguration, and it turned into an hour-and-a-half visit and highly substantive. In her inaugural speech, she said, "It is of great importance that we improve our relationship with the U.S. because of the country's economic, political, scientific, and technological importance, as well as the volume of our bilateral trade. Second largest destination for Brazilian exports and the largest for manufactured goods." Another point of optimism is the nomination of officials familiar with the U.S., including our friends Ambassador Mauro Vieira and Joaquim Levy to key cabinet positions. They can be strong and interlocutors who really understand and can help construct and implement a substantive agenda that I think both administrations want to see. Great interest in leadership here in the U.S. as well, from Secretary Kerry on down in the State Department and at the NSC and the Vice President's office. The nomination of Ambassador Figueiredo to come to Washington, I think, is another sign of importance to the relationship. And hopefully the Congresses in both countries can be helpers rather than impediments. Our Congress sometimes can be a little cantankerous, in case you hadn't noticed. But there was a visiting delegation led by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair in November. I had the pleasure with former Ambassador Tom Shannon of joining him for dinner. Very candid and warm discussion with an interest in moving the relationship forward. It was very multi-partisan, too, the group from Brazil. Here, maybe we will see at the White House, President Obama and the congressional leadership cooperating on trade promotion as an area of agreement, and it might help us move down the road of cinching more closely the trade ties. There have been a few successes that have occurred, notwithstanding a period of a bit of a stall. The resolution of the WTO cotton case twice was important. Brazil's approval of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act was an important step toward our long march to achieve a bilateral tax treaty. And even during the doldrums of the relationship, there was quiet collaboration on international internet governance, the large conference that was hosted in Brazil, in which I was pleased to play a part in connecting the dots between, and so there was direct collaboration with the U.S. government and Brazilian government. As Peter suggested, I want to recognize and encourage the continued vital role that the private sector and organizations such as the Atlantic Council, the Brazil Council, the Wilson Center, and others play in bringing our countries close together. These ties, the business ties, continued unabated when we were in a bit of a slowdown. And the external environment shows signs of giving reason for hope as well. The long past due decision to move forward in our relationship with Cuba will be helpful in removing a sticking point throughout the region, and Brazil has always had a bit of a special relationship with Cuba. So we're hopeful that state visit will be rescheduled for later this year. Believe that the White House and Planalto want to see it, but that both want to have a substantive agenda. I think President Rousseff said she didn't want just a black tie event. And our panelists can talk a good bit more, as I said, about what the agenda will look like. But it's going to take serious thinking and work, contribution from organizations such as this and many in the room to turn good intentions into concrete results. It's not just a question of having meetings, it's really moving things forward in a specific way. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jason Marczak, Deputy Director, to begin the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Harrington. And thank you all for being, I know it was difficult with the 2-hour school closings in Washington. I was thinking I probably couldn't even shovel my front steps if I needed to. But thanks everyone for coming in. And thanks for those excellent remarks, Ambassador Harrington and Peter, for your opening as well. I think that that really helped set the stage. A lot of the topics you discussed, we're going to further elaborate on as part of the panel. And we are delighted to have 4 excellent panelists here to share their thoughts on where Brazil stands today, just a few weeks after Dilma's inauguration to her second term, and the future scenarios for U.S.-Brazil relations. To my left is Raul Juste. Raul is, many of you have probably seen Raul's work. He's the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Folha de São Paulo, which is Brazil's largest newspaper. And he has also been the Beijing correspondent and the New York City bureau chief. To Raul's left is Lisa Schineller. Lisa is an economist and managing director in the Sovereign's Ratings Department for Latin America and at Standard & Poor's, and she traveled down from New York City to be with us. At Standard & Poor's, she covers sovereign analysis and forecasting for Brazil and many other countries across the region. So Lisa keeps very, very busy. To Lisa's left is Ricardo Sennes. Ricardo is our non-resident senior Brazil fellow here at the Latin America Center. He's actually decided to spend the month of January, of all months, in Washington with us.
Enjoying the weather.
Enjoying the weather. Where I was telling Ricardo, I saw this morning, it's 27 here in Washington and 72 in Sao Paulo. So thank you very much. Ricardo, many of you probably know Ricardo, but he's also the managing partner at Prospectiva, which is a consulting firm based in Brazil. And he's also the general coordinator of the Group of International Analysis at the University of Sao Paulo. And then to Ricardo's left is Nick Sprague. Nick is the Vice President for Legal and Institutional Relations with Braskem, which is a Brazilian petrochemical company. And he has worked on projects across the U.S. and Latin America. And Nick came down from Philadelphia to be a part of this discussion today. So thank you all for being here. I think Ambassador Harrington really and Peter set the stage for our conversation. But I think just quickly to point out is that it's often easy to lose sight of how much Brazil is an important strategic partner for the United States. It's not just why the U.S. matters for Brazil, but it's also very much why Brazil matters for the U.S. You know, Brazil is our 9th largest trading partner. Brazil has a presence across the U.S. through companies like Braskem that has a significant U.S. presence. Other companies like Embraer and JBS Foods. And its companies have also acquired brands such as Burger King, Heinz, and Budweiser. So there's significant collaboration among the private sectors between the U.S. and Brazil. And there's also a lot of engagement that already happens. Not only the number of Brazilian firms in the U.S., the number of U.S. firms in Brazil, but also the increasing number of Brazilian students that are studying in the U.S. and the many levels in which the two governments are already working together on a very technical levels, from everything from urban sustainability to youth sports to open government. A lot of things that don't oftentimes make the headlines, but are symbolic of our relationship. So we're gonna begin the conversation today looking first at some of the current political and economic situation. Then we'll move to the bilateral agenda, including how it's seen by both capitals as well as by the private sector. And then we'll look at opportunities and challenges to build on the relationships already in place. And we're also going to try and move the panel to draw out as many specific recommendations as possible to come away with as part of this conversation. We're going to do this in a Davos-style conversation format, and this is also being webcast. And so if you're watching via webcast and you have questions, you can always tweet your questions to @ACLATAM. So Ricardo, let's start off by looking at what's happened in the first few weeks in the Dilma government. As Ambassador Harrington was mentioning, some of the new cabinet ministers, Joaquim Levy as the finance minister, Nelson Barbosa as planning and budget minister. How do you interpret these names? Is this a new direction in which Dilma is going to go in her second term?
Thank you, Jason. It's also a pleasure to be here. Yes, I think there is a significant change in the way Dilma has defining his team of ministers. And I think that the change is not just in terms of technical level or if she change the economic team from a more heterodox approach for a more orthodox approach. I think she made a political strategic movement. I would say that this new team is very much the political formula that Lula assumed 10 years ago. When Lula tried to combine technical capacity with a broad political support in the Congress and in other political constituencies in the country, he took more or less the profile of ministers that Dilma has just chosen. I would say that just to start the discussion with the economic team, when we have Joaquim Levy and Nelson Barbosa is the Minister of Planning. She's putting two guys with very complementary capacities and skills. Joaquim Barbosa, I would say, I'm walking to this meeting thinking what person could have the same profile of Joaquim Levy, because he's a Chicago boy. We call him like that because he's have a very good formal education in economics in an orthodox school like Chicago. But at the same time, Joaquim has worked for three different political parties in the country. For PSDB, during the Fernando Cardoso term, for Sérgio Cabral at PMDB in the state of Rio de Janeiro, and also for PT, both in the beginning of the Lula's term. So he's not just a technical guy. He's a very skilled political guy. And Nelson Barbosa has a different profile. He's a very formal education also, but he has more a political proximity to Lula, etc. So this combination is very interesting to understand what the move Dilma has made. Completing the team, we have two very important guys, the guy in the Ministry of Industry and the woman at the Ministry of Agriculture and agribusiness. So again, if you compare what Dilma had as minister and these two ministers with these two new guys, both of them have strong relations with the sectors, the sectors. Well, Armando used to be the president of CNI, the National Confederation of Industry, and Katia Abreu, besides being a senator, she also a president of the National Agribusiness Association. So there is a very strong change in this choice, and I think it's very meaningful for understand what Dilma would try to do in these next 4 years.
And somebody like Joaquin Levy is also somebody who's very well known in the U.S. as well. So it gives that. Lisa, how are the ratings likely to respond to the market-friendly economics team that Dilma has put in place?
Yeah, we at Standard & Poor's, we were the only rating agency who has downgraded Brazil. We downgraded Brazil last March, really because of the combination of what we see as a low growth environment, for a couple of years, the deterioration on the fiscal accounts, off budget, on budget, qualitative, quantitative, the maneuvering around the accounts, ahead of the election, which we didn't expect a strong adjustment, and real question about an adjustment post the election. Yeah. President in a second term, lower political capital, and since then the governability, so to speak, challenges. We're not really concerned in the big picture sense, solid democracy, et cetera, but the coalition making is a challenge for Dilma, has been. You saw that in her first term. Yeah. So we had real questions that, less room for maneuver and consistent with a lower rating. At this point, kind of the signaling that you see from this policy, from this economic team is different. And we see this as part of why we also have a stable outlook on the rating, even though we downgraded, was because we do see Brazil, in our base case, low investment grade credit, so not moving to the spec grade category because of institutional strengths, which I would throw in is the private sector, the business community, opposition is more emboldened, but independent economists, and this structure, kind of in the wake of, I would say, the kind of being pushed with the allegations of corruption at Petrobras. I mean, the president found herself in even more of a tighter situation, and you responded, as Brazil does, more under with, kind of this kind of a team coming out. Yeah. So the signaling that and the policies that we'll talk through a bit more later, but the signaling from the team is definitely we see as a change. Mm-hmm. That said, there was a long kind of and a slow deterioration in an undermining in macroeconomic policy credibility making. So to make that up, yes, we want some signaling, which we're certainly seeing coming from the finance ministry, but that has to be backed by the broader political class, the president, Congress, over time. So sustained execution is one of the things we'd be looking for. Yeah, yeah.
And also when you look at across you look at emerging markets, not only across Latin America, but across the world, and the strong institutions with Brazil, I think really differentiates some of how you look at Brazil versus. Yeah. And we'll get into the Petrobras a little bit later, but Raul, she also named, as Ambassador Harrington mentioned, Maura Vieira, who is the ambassador in Washington, as her new foreign minister, with the previous foreign minister now coming to Washington. How do you interpret this move, and what will be some of the challenges for the new foreign minister moving forward, especially in regard to how do you interpret this as regard to U.S.-Brazil relations moving forward?
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. I mean, it couldn't be better to someone who wants the strengthening of the relationship between the U.S. and Brazil to have Ambassador Vieira as the new foreign minister. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have someone with a good Rolodex of Washington ties. He lived here for 5 years, what's a lot in diplomatic terms, and he just appointed as his chief of staff Ambassador Júlio Bitelli, who was a political counselor at the Brazilian embassy some years ago. So basically, 2 among the 3 most powerful diplomats now in Brazil, they have a great experience in Washington. So that's good news. I think his main challenge actually is more internal before of engaging Brazil with the U.S. the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil had its budget it has been shrinking a lot lately. It was actually cut in half in the last 2 years. So imagine if the State Department in 2 years had its budget cut in half. So his challenge is to convince President Dilma of the importance of foreign relations and foreign affairs and to engage. And you guys know that in any country, if the president is not that engaged with the foreign leaders, if he doesn't have like great friends or close friends abroad, if he doesn't travel as he or she should, it's a challenge. But again, I think Ambassador Vieira couldn't be a better name, has very close ties both with Dilma and with President Lula. He also had important positions during the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration. So that's good news, but again, I think his challenge is in the government how to put Itamaraty and put foreign policy again in the forefront.
Yeah, and this has been, historically a challenge with Dilma during her tenure, and especially with the economic focus. How do you kind of balance that with this desire that Ambassador Vieira will have insofar as on the foreign policy side? Nick, I'd like to bring you in the discussion. We've seen, the business perspective on the ground in Brazil. I'd like for you to give your insight on how are you seeing the kind of these first few weeks from, Lisa talked about the new team and what that means insofar as signaling for the markets. Ricardo talked a little bit more his analysis of the team itself, but specifically for a company like Braskem, manufacturing is a key industry in Brazil. How are you seeing the manufacturing climate like in Brazil, and what are you seeing not only right now but also as you look a year out in the future? What do you see as some of your analysis of the scenario?
Yeah, I think this last week we saw a lot of news on the automobile industry in Brazil, and I think that's somewhat representative of the challenges that manufacturing in general is going through right now. I think on the challenging side, you've got the demand slowdown, which is obviously going to impact high electricity prices, potential for water reliability issues for industry. We've had a very impressive growth in wages over the last 10 years, but we've actually fallen in productivity, which is a major structural challenge. And then the usual tax, infrastructure, logistics challenges for exporters, et cetera. So you've got all of those things going on right now that are obviously putting Brazilian industry in a situation of pausing and reassessing where they are. On the positive side, Brazil is a huge country. And whether the demand curve is trending upward or downward, there's always going to be, in total volume, a large demand. Manufacturers in Brazil still have the opportunity to have an advantaged relationship with local suppliers, service providers, and customers based on having a local presence. And then in general, you look at the big picture and you say, Brazil has so many smart people, great resources, a high capacity for innovation. And at some point in time, Brazil is going to be a great place to manufacture, right? 10 years ago, people did not think of the U.S. as a good place to manufacture. Shale gas boom happens, a series of other things, and all of a sudden people are saying, oh, the U.S. is a great place to manufacture. The same thing will happen in Brazil. So I think for those who are in it for the long term, there's going to continue to be a focus on preserving their position and being sure that they'll be ready, willing, and able to take advantage of that moment when it comes. So for the next couple of years, what should we expect to happen? I think we'll continue to see Brazilian manufacturers or foreign manufacturers who manufacture in Brazil look to expand and diversify their manufacturing base outside of Brazil. As you mentioned, a series of companies that have come to the U.S., Braskem being one of them. And I think we'll continue to see, and even if it's not through mergers and acquisitions, it'll be joint marketing agreements, commercial relationships, joint ventures, creative ways for Brazilian manufacturers to hedge during this period. I think you'll see industry will continue to push the government on a comprehensive industrial policy that will try and address some of the challenges that I mentioned before. I think you will see Brazilian manufacturers look towards innovation to try and get more creative, to close those gaps, either through using technology or through changing their business processes to try and figure out a way to close the competitiveness gap. And coming off of the boom that we had, where everything was so good, companies were growing, number of employees were growing, new business opportunities were being explored pretty profoundly. I think you'll see the next couple of years, Brazilian manufacturers will take the opportunity to get leaner, to get more efficient in their processes, to become tougher, and to become more productive. So by the end of this down cycle, Brazilian companies will be in a better position to capitalize on the next boom.
And I mean, we mentioned, get lean, get tougher, be more productive. I mean, that doesn't seem to me anything different from manufacturers, whether it's in the U.S., Brazil, or global. I mean, that's kind of the general trend. Either way. Nick, you mentioned a bunch of challenges. You mentioned the water crisis, electricity costs going up. There's also Brazil has a negative commercial balance now for the first time in 14 years. You mentioned also the possibility that this could be a moment for pushing a comprehensive commercial policy from Dilma. Ricardo, how do you see Dilma responding to these challenges that Nick is laying out here? And do you see these challenges as potentially affecting also the relationship with the United States in some way?
Well, I think to answer this, we have to get back to what Lisa mentioned. Dilma is just part of the decision-making process of the country. The Brazil, as everybody knows, is a presidentialism by coalition. And besides this is a federation. And besides this, we have a very decentralized policy-making process. So as Lisa mentioned, the point is not just the Minister of Finance, but how all this agenda can cross through the decision-making process in the country, engage the local businessmen, the foreign companies, the union laborers. This, I think, is a basic, much more a political challenger rather than a technical issue. So how to combine all this demand that is in the same time is going to the table of Dilma and the others. So I think to understand Brazil, we need to understand that it's a very diversified country with a complex society, with a different regional contexts. In the economy in the country, the business community in the country are divided. Mm-hmm. The business community is not a single unit in terms of demand in the country. So your question about how Dilma will manage this, or she's prepared or not to answer this, I think they are. I think in general, if you take in the long term, how Brazil is being able to combine different policies, fostering innovation, very dramatically in the last few years, putting a lot of money, a lot of effort, bringing laws, approving laws that for tax exemption for companies who invest in innovation, combining with social policy, combining with some kind of macroeconomic stabilization. And this point, I think, I would like to highlight. Even though Lisa mentioned that there is an enormous challenge to regain a better situation in the macroeconomic management, it is true, I think, that the country are not accepting mismanagement in macroeconomic sense. What we saw in this election was Dilma crossed the line that the country will accept in terms of pressuring inflation or fostering inflation, putting the fiscal imbalance in such a situation that the country is not approving. So we do have a very deep consensus in the country that macroeconomic management must be in certain level in terms of international standards. At the same time, we have to combine with this different policy. Again, in general, if you take the policy that Brazil has been taking with the severe social inequality that we have in country and severe inequality that we have between among the regions, I think in general, we do have good answers in the last, I would say, 20 years. If you take from the 90s to today, what we have in terms of revolution in terms of the industry. 20 years ago, we don't have Braskem in the U.S., Gerdau in the U.S., Friboi and GBS in the U.S. We don't have the BTG in the U.S. We don't have anything of this, and now we do have. So we are moving, I think, slowly than we would like to, but at the same time, taking in consideration the very deep social and political challenge that the country has been dealing with, I think we are doing quite a good job. So I think Dilma, after, you're right, I think Dilma make a lot of mistakes, but I wouldn't say that the mistake are putting Brazil in a risk area in terms of going in depression, going a complete social disruption or political turmoil. I think we are moving still in a sense that even though taking into consideration all this complexity, I think Dilma is again putting in the center of the agenda what would be, I think, the possible common agenda for the country.
And I think that unfortunately, what happens in the U.S. is there's this reaction to what's happening in Brazil. I mean, probably some of you listen to NPR in the morning. There was a story just this morning on NPR in Brazil, and this story about how Christmas sales are down, and a family can't travel to Europe now; they can only travel within Brazil, and so there is this tendency to kind of to overreact. Lisa, what's the perception of Brazil's economic scenario that Nick and Ricardo are just discussing? What's the perception from the U.S. business community now?
Yeah, from the kind of certainly from the financial market perspective,
from the financial market perspective,
it is a pessimistic view. Brazil's low growth story and outlook is one of the reasons we lower the rating, and in combination with other things. The growth, the track record, and that's also for emerging markets. I think also that's an important point to put on the table. You're thinking of pre-global and post-global crisis. And Brazil has some external kind of pressures when you're thinking of what's happening, the slower growth in China feeding into commodity prices, et cetera, that hit them. More recently we've got the oil on the headlines, but more kind of them across the board, and be it soy, iron ore, et cetera. You've got the when rates will be going up in the U.S. as quantitative easing as the tapering has ended, and so you have a favorable backdrop, for EM overall. In the meantime, Brazil's reform agenda has stagnated, and all the ports have been contracting. You have the manufacturing sector also contracting. The consumer in Brazil has now much higher levels of indebtedness, so they can't provide the kind of motor that they did for a number of years. Very positive in financial sector intermediation, reflecting very good things, but then got a little too frothy. And now you're at a point where, the unemployment rate really has only one way to go right now, and that's going to be a challenging situation. Yeah. So putting better policy signals on the table to kind of help turn around the investment climate, and the trade, kind of the prospect of, taking down some of the trade barriers, kind of, opening up on the external side, with some incipient signals coming from the economic team would be positive. Yeah. This will take time. But those are the kind of things that, kind of, I would say the markets are looking for, kind of trying to disentangle, the cyclical versus the structural. And, we have growth, there's the near-term energy rationing risk, question mark, et cetera, the damped investment with the Petrobras investigation, the extraction companies, the near-term outlook isn't solid. So all of the more importance of putting, and the likely this year of some correction, monetary policy, fiscal policy, to help, that correction will hurt growth near term, but boost growth more medium term, assuming you have execution and follow through.
Yeah. And you mentioned one of the biggest stories in Brazil about recently. Obviously, the Petrobras corruption scandal, which obviously affects not only Petrobras, but it's also the U.S.-Brazil relationship. And Petrobras is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It's now being sued by the city of Providence and in Rhode Island as part of a class action suit. Raul, what do you see as some of the maybe potential political ramifications of the Petrobras situation for the U.S.-Brazil relationship?
I mean, it's a big question mark. I mean, first of all, how many important figures of the political landscape in Brazil will be touched and affected by the Petrobras scandal? So then we can imagine how the relationship is going to deteriorate. I would say, I mean, in the stock market perspective, I mean, the disaster has already happened. And I think many others can join, actually, the class action by the city of Providence. It's what the lawyers are trying to get. I mean, more and more. So, I mean, I think the problem has already started. I think domestically speaking in Brazil, the danger is how much people are affected and are actually involved in
the Dilma coalition. Actually, I think the centerpiece of this scandal is the PMDB. But besides PMDB, that's one of the most important allies of the Dilma and the PT. But will affect also some people in PT and PSB, and also in other political parties. But I think the central piece would be as PMDB, who is a critical political party in the Congress, mainly in the Senate. So that means this can increase the level of noisy of Dilma to operate this her second term. But at the same time, I think there is this political aspect from one side. The other side, I think the scandal in Petrobras, we have to take, again, all the complexity of this issue in consideration. All these scandals are affecting the refinery side of Petrobras. The most important part of Petrobras is the exploration and production. All the investments that Petrobras are making, the huge investment that Petrobras are made, are going to that area for exploration and production. So the refinery aspect of the Petrobras will be affected, for sure, but not necessarily the other side of Petrobras, in a sense that you're dealing right now with the bankruptcy of Petrobras. I would say no. I would say that we will face a lot of problems in terms of how to re-engage part of the society, the investor in Petrobras, but the core business of Petrobras has moved from the refinery science to the exploration and production. And the results that we have combined with these scandals, Petrobras in 2014 has the largest production index in the history in terms of oil and gas. So how could you, and they are reaching a quite good result in the pre-salt exploration, above the average in terms of statistical success in this kind of exploration. So I think the point here is how to manage all this enormous crisis, scandal and political scandal, do not allow them to affect the potential that Petrobras has in terms of as a company and the importance that Petrobras has to the country. I think the ability of Dilma will be not to buffer the scandal, but try to operate politically how the scandal can affect the rest of the political agenda. Unfortunately, in this sense, I think I'm not seeing that Dilma is doing a correct move. I think there is a lot of criticism in a sense that why Dilma did not make a barrier, a very clear wall between this scandal and the rest of the management of Petrobras, etc. This, I think, is something that we have to discuss. But again, we are not in a point in which Petrobras has already, the scandal of Petrobras has already deteriorate completely the political environment. I think there is a potential for that. I think Dilma must operate in that sense. I think she's not doing all the necessary steps that she should, but we still have to observe, follow closely what's going on in that area.
And Lisa, what is Petrobras' rating at the moment? And also, how is this also affecting kind of the markets in general? I mean, because the Petrobras scandal is not just tied to Petrobras, but it kind of has larger implications for how the kind of general business climate, the perceptions at least of the general business climate.
Yeah, certainly it hits the perceptions of the business climate, and obviously you've already seen ramifications for other companies who do work with Petrobras. The companies who can no longer do business with Petrobras, et cetera. So that'll weigh on the growth outlook in Brazil, open up opportunities maybe for U.S. companies to work more with Petrobras. So there's something there. From the rating perspective, we look at Petrobras, we rate it. It's a government-related entity, obviously partly government-owned, key government company, partially government-owned. Reputational importance for the government, key role in the economy. So we rate it by looking at its what we call standalone credit profile. So its own, kind of the financial fundamentals, et cetera, as well as its links with the government. We have a kind of, which includes the potential the potential for extraordinary government support if needed to help support debt payments, right, by Petrobras. And we think there's a very high likelihood of support, the way we look at its role in the economy and its links with the government. And that has not changed. With its standalone credit profile, which we have weakened, right, and I'll come back to that, but the rating, the combination of this as it stands today, is at the same level of the sovereign, BBB minus, with a stable outlook, because we at this point, while we have some movement downward on the standalone credit profile, it's not getting low enough that you could have a lowering of the overall rating. But the scandal, the allegations, is having a significant impact on the company. And we lowered the standalone credit profile 2 notches from to the BB, a little BB, because there's the prospect of weakened liquidity. They cannot access the market. This is an issue, right? And this potential then for cash flow pressures over the coming years. We have risk of fines. The question of not being able to, until you have audited financials out, they can't access the market, and if you're not, you're going to be potentially some acceleration clauses, covenants could be coming in. So there's obviously we also embedded in our downgrade of the standalone credit profile weaker governance, right? And so even though you could say that it may be just kind of refining components, but it's hitting the whole company. And there's the question of if you don't have access to markets, and we think that some adjustment in capex becoming presumably not on the E&P side, exploration and production side, but that's key on being able to access kind of funding. Yeah. And so we see the rating, we see support from the government there, but certainly the underlying financials of the company are under strain.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's turn to a more positive topic. Let's turn to future opportunities on U.S.-Brazil specific cooperation. I'm going to talk we'll talk here for another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll leave the last 15, 20 minutes to questions from everybody in the audience. And if you're on webcast, tweet at ACLINM, and we'll get the questions. So, Nick, one area in which Brazil is gaining attention is its burgeoning tech sector. We already have lots of U.S.-Brazil cooperation in this space, including university to university, business-to-business cooperation. What would be some of your recommendations for how both the U.S. and Brazil could deepen this type of cooperation that is so fundamental for the bilateral relationship?
Well, I think what's interesting is that regardless of what the public sector agenda is, this is already taking place. And even on the policy side, things like Science Without Borders, the huge movement of U.S. universities going down to Brazil on kind of trade missions, fact-finding missions, the number of new relationships that have been set up university to university is already creating, in the research environment at the university level, a very natural flow back and forth among students and professors, particularly in the sciences. So a grad student in Brazil who is doing their PhD research in a particular area is going to leverage the newfound contacts that their university in Brazil has with the university in the U.S. They go to the U.S. for 6 months, have access to the specialized technology lab, do their research, go back to Brazil, combine their research with what they have in Brazil, present their findings. Similar in the U.S., you're going to have graduate students in the U.S. going down to Brazil, having access to Brazil's technical labs, field labs. And this is going to eventually creep its way up on the business side. From private sector to private sector, with Braskem, for example, we already have almost a seamless technology cooperation between an innovation center that we have in Triunfo in Rio Grande do Sul, and an innovation center that we have in Pittsburgh, where we've been manufacturing both in Brazil and in the United States for many years. You have high-end scientists working in both labs. They have different experiences, different focuses based on particular product grades that may be weighted one part. Some people may have more expertise in catalysts. Other people may have more expertise in plastics resins technology. And what happens is a client, say in the automobile sector, will come to Braskem in Brazil and say, I need, a bumper product that's lighter, but also safer, stronger. And they'll say, okay, since the technology center scientists in Pittsburgh have a longer history of working on applications for the automobile industry, let's bring them into the mix. Let's talk about what have you done in the past? How have you adjusted your plastics resins to produce, a stronger grade, but that's also lighter, et cetera. Same thing for U.S. to Brazil. We've been doing some things in Brazil a lot longer, have more experience there. We have an issue that comes up from a client in the U.S. We reach out to the colleagues in Brazil and say, how do you adjust your catalyst technology here? What was your experience in that? And it's almost seamless. So I think that's the future. I think the university-to-university contacts is only going to increase kind of that capacity, and then business-to-business will leapfrog off that.
I think I saw last year there was a 15% increase in the number of Brazilian students studying in the United States, and of course Dilma has a huge focus on Science Without Borders to be able to bring more Brazilian students to the U.S. to 100,000 is obviously the goal in a few years. So huge opportunities I've seen for companies like Braskem.
Yeah, we actually host Science Without Borders students. They'll come to the U.S. They'll do their year of school in one of the science engineering schools, and then they'll come and work for us for a summer. And we actually go through a training program where once they go back and finish their university, if it was a successful experience, we'll hire them in Brazil. So the private sector is capitalizing off of the public sector, the public policy initiative, and like I said, this is only going to increase. I know Ohio State, a bunch of other schools have now set up offices in Brazil. And it's not just to find recruiting. What they're really doing is they're trying to figure out the lay of the land and see how they can leverage their brands to either plant the flag in Brazil in the future or set up exclusive relationships with universities in Brazil in the future, because they want to capitalize on all the human capital, the wealth that Brazilian students can bring to American universities, and the capacity for innovation. Yeah.
No, it's a huge, I think, educational exchanges, business to business, private sector, but also, the more, public sector employees and policymakers that have the opportunity to study in the U.S., the better it is for the relationship, as we know, globally overall. Raul, one thing that's Peter alluded to in his opening remarks was President Obama's announcement of a new Cuba policy. I know this is not a Cuba. If you're not a Cuba discussion, if you're not in the wrong space, but it has implications far beyond Washington and Havana. As Peter said, there's fundamentally a shift in our relations with the rest of the hemisphere. How is this? What are the implications of this as we're talking about the U.S.-Brazil relationship? What are the implications for the U.S.-Brazil relationship that in many ways has been, it's been soured in the last year through the Snowden affair, Dilma's canceled state visit, which she said, right after her inauguration that she plans on coming to the U.S. by September, I believe, of this year. But how does something like this announcement, and obviously the Brazilians have a lot of investment interests, in Cuba. How do you see that affecting the bilateral
I think
relationship?
it helps a lot, the bilateral relations. I mean, the regional relations, actually, we can't forget that both the president of Mexico and president of Colombia, closest American allies, were also pushing President Obama to start a dialogue with Cuba, or at least allow Cuba to join the next Summit of Americas. I think Cuba, for too long, has emboldened the two extremist sides in the U.S.-Brazil relations. The ones that see a communist threat everywhere, who only look at Cuba and forget the rest, and our leftists who see the American empire everywhere. So these two sides were dominating the conversation for too long. I mean, if you take like the last 20 years, most of the heads of Latin American policy in the US, they come from the Cuban-American ground.
Yeah.
And they talk too much about Cuba and Chavez and too little about other countries. And that creates a very negative environment. And we can't forget that, I mean, one of the big problems that I think elephants in the room in our relationship, I mean, there are two. One is the legacy of the Cold War. And I think the two sides need to start moving on, but acknowledging like past grievances. So we can talk about democracy in Cuba, but we can talk also about military dictatorships that the US supported. And that's something that we don't talk about it. And another very important issue, I mean, now that the Cuba issue is starting to diminish, is how the US can deal with a big partner, a big ally in the region, not a small country that says yes all the time. And I think that's a big problem. I think many countries, many emerging countries like Brazil and China and others, sometimes they feel that both Europe and the US are not in a rush to reform the multilateral institutions, to give a bigger say to those countries. We can say about the reform of the IMF, that has been installed in the US Congress for so long. I mean, actually, the US is the only country has not voted this reform so far. So I think if we can start engaging in other issues instead of this left against right conversation for the last 20, 30 years, I mean, it's progress.
Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air on a cold winter day. I mean, it really allows us to think. Ricardo, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to add two comments on this debate about Brazil-U.S. potential new agenda or relationship. I'm in that sense, I'm not that optimistic. I sense we do have room for improve this relationship. I think, as Nick mentioned, if you take the societal side of this relationship, I think it's going quite well. The level of connections that we have from the business sector, the universities, research centers, media, etc., it's clear that we have a very tough and deep relationship with US in terms of the society side of this element, this aspect. If you take the macroeconomic, macro-political relationship, I would say the geopolitical relationship, we do have good relations. I think, as Raul mentioned, we have been moving from this very traditional Cold War relationship for, I think, since the middle of the 90s, the US and Brazil reached a common, I would say, tacit recognition that Brazil has some role in terms of South America, and the US has some common interest in the area. I think it's okay in terms of, it's a kind of accommodation, geopolitical accommodation. I think the problem, even though we are among several colleagues here from the diplomatic and the government agencies, I think the problem continues to be in the middle, in a sense, in the political relationship. I think Ambassador has mentioned that we do not know very well each other in this level. I think for instance, do the U.S. government really understand all the political making process in Brazil in a deep sense, in a sense that there is really engaging different. It's the same for the Brazilian constituency, political constituency in Brazil. We do understand how the policies are made in the U.S., how important is the districts for take decision in the Congress. Some of the companies have been operating in this sense, and with very good histories to tell. So some organized interests in Brazil that do understand how to operate here, in a sense that we have to connect with the congressman, to understand the local interest of these people, and put them connected, for instance, in universities. We should, Paulo and Peter, we should go to the universities that has this connection with Brazil. And these universities are located in specific cities. These specific cities has a specific representative. This representative is just right here. So these people must talk about Brazil relationship in a sense that they do have a concrete interest in relation. They know Brazil and the Brazilians know them. So I think the middle part of this relationship is not going well. I think we cannot expect huge change now, with Dilma right now, and even for the last 2 years of Obama. But we do have room for improvement, but not unfortunately, for a radical change. But as you said, the good news is the society, both in Brazil and the U.S., has been increasingly being connected in a very positive way.
So, Ricardo, you're writing a paper with the Atlantic Council this month on exploring the U.S.-Brazil agenda, looking at issues like energy, technology, trade, tourism, and others. If you could name just maybe 2 areas, or 2 specific things that could be done to enhance cooperation in one of the areas that you're looking at, what would those be?
I think would be technological cooperation and innovation. I think there is a lot of good examples and a positive response for both governments in terms of how to improve this relationship. I think, unfortunately, we had this spying problem between Brazil and the U.S., but in this agenda 2 years ago was going quite well, with a huge collaboration in terms of aerospace, in defense industry, and IT industry. The most important IT company in Brazil, they do already have the research centers in the U.S. with a huge collaboration besides the industrial and manufacturing area. So I think innovation and technology would be one of them for sure. The second, I think, can be service, trade in service in different areas. If you take the Brazil exports in terms of goods, U.S. is important, 12–15%, but it's not as important as in service. And the same for Brazil and the U.S. Brazil, the exports of service from the U.S. to Brazil, it's similar to the amount of exportation that the U.S. has to France. So in this sense, Brazil is very well positioned in terms of bilateral sense. So I think in this area that includes service, includes education, includes tourism, a lot of industry, transportations. So in this area, I think we have a new agenda that we can improve. I would, as you asked me, just 2 topics, technology and service.
Okay. I have other questions of the panelists, but I'm going to just one last question to Nick and save my other questions so we could open up questions from everybody here. But Nick, just on Ricardo's point about bilateral commerce. A trade agreement is still a long way off. So what else is possible in the short term to enhance commerce cooperation?
I want to echo what Ambassador Harrington said about the tax treaty. I mean, this is already a long build-up, but the reality is this is a no-brainer for the U.S. and Brazil. There really shouldn't be any constituencies on either side that would be against this. From the Brazilian company side, it's a huge problem not having a tax treaty because sending dividends back to Brazil is uncompetitive. From the U.S. side, there's been such a huge push on trying to attract Brazilian investment to the United States. There's been I don't know the statistic, but I think the consulate in Brazil told me that it's been 37 governors from the U.S. have gone down to Brazil in the last 4 years to try and drum up investment into the United States. And it's a problem that the governors can't tell potential investors, and oh, by the way, we have a very competitive climate for you to be able to distribute dividends back to Brazil. Mm-hmm. So I think on both sides, there shouldn't be a structural barrier to this. And I think it would be a huge first step in bringing together kind of closer ties on trade and investment. It would be a wonderful story for the American delegations to be able to go down to Brazil and say, this is as competitive as an environment as any for you to invest. And it would be wonderful for Brazilian companies to not feel constrained about either investing in the U.S. or being concerned about having trapped cash or having to find creative ways or doing other things as opposed to sending the money back to Brazil. I think on the trade agenda that you mentioned, I think this is something that it's almost like a huge merger that would have to take place. And if there's a narrative that one party is more interested in the merger than the other and is going to try and take a leadership role in that, I think tactics and substance is really important. And if you want to do a big merger like that, I think the wrong approach would be to send over to the other party a term sheet that says, this is what I want, and let's negotiate until I get it or until I get somewhere close to it. I think tactically, the right approach would be thinking about who is really going to suffer on the stakeholder side for the other party if we move down the path that I want to go. And what can I do creatively right now, thinking about solving their problem, so that when I go to the other side and present to them my term sheet is not, here's what I want, but it's, here's how I can help you. Here's what I can do to solve your problem. I think that's the kind of approach. It's subtle leadership, it's humility, but it's also thinking long-term about how am I going to meet the needs of all the stakeholders who would be impacted by this in order to move that ball down the field.
Great. Well, I think you might be getting a call from USTR now. Questions from the audience, please raise your hand. We have microphones going around. Just ask you to state your name and affiliation. And we'll actually probably take a couple of questions, the first round of questions together. I saw the first hand there in the fifth row with the pink sweater. If you could just identify yourself, please. And then Evan will get to your question after that.
Thank you. I'm Mary Ellen Cannell from the Center for Naval Analyses, and I wondered what you thought, the panelists thought of the possibilities for defense cooperation between the United States and Brazil. Does the new relationship with Cuba, for example, make that possibility more likely?
Great, thank you. And there's a question here in the fourth row, Evan Ellis, and then we'll take the question. We'll take your question, then we'll take three questions together. We'll take Evans first.
Hi, it's a question for Lisa. I'd like to know
Can you identify yourself, please?
Cláudia Trevisan from the Brazilian newspaper Estado de São Paulo. Like, in which conditions the Standard & Poor's could change its outlook for Brazil? Like, reforms would be necessary, even with a low growth, or the low growth is the main concern? And also, if you are concerned about Brazilian companies in a scenario of the real depreciation, could it put strains in the capacity of the companies to fulfill their obligations?
Great, thank you. And Thomas says there's a question right behind her.
Thank you. Evan Ellis, Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College. Although this is a panel on U.S.-Brazil relations, I wonder if I could draw out the panel to talk a little bit about Brazil's possible changing relations with extra-regional actors under the new Dilma administration. Specifically, the always balancing orientation towards China between threat and complement, the often neglected importance of India as a partner, the possible collaboration or continuing collaboration with Russia, particularly in the defense sector, and of course other actors that we saw lower the profile, such as Iran under President Rouhani.
Great, thank you. Lisa, we'll start off the question addressed directly to you.
Sure. I think, in terms of the growth story, it's not the low growth itself, it's what's behind low growth, right? And so say you have, I sort of alluded to, you have low growth this year for a variety of factors, one of which, if that's because in part you're taking some steps to correct imbalances, that we would view positively, because we think that should lead to improvements over time. So it'll be problematic if, say, you take those steps and no growth will follow, right? So so that's one thing. But I think from the rating perspective, we have a stable outlook. So what you could think about that would improve the rating would be policies, signaling, execution, that will improve the fiscal dynamics, broadly speaking. That you feed into stronger growth dynamics as well. As the macro policy re-anchoring coupled with signs on microreform agenda, those are examples that are being talked about. So that's kind of the story. On the downside, clearly if you have a stepping away, a deeper stepping away from a commitment on the policy front, which again was not our base case even when we downgraded, but say there's, because of these institutional strengths that kind of highlighted, but say you have more of an unraveling of policy, say there's a shock, and it's not managed well, and you get some additional pressure on the government's balance sheet and on the external accounts in a meaningful way that is just not being adjusted to properly, that's something that you could think about on the negative side. But on the positive side, it's not that no growth, clearly you want to see some signs that growth would be coming around, but we would be wanting to look at policy signaling as a key component. On the corporate side, on balance, we have the vast majority of our outlooks are stable for the corporate ratings that we have. But then after you move away from that, there's more negatives than positives. And sectors such as the sugarcane, et cetera, metals and mining, I say with the real estate, that's where we have more pressures. And those ratings, sugar and real estate, et cetera, they would be very spec grade, kind of in the single B-ish potential category. So they're going to be more risky, right? Two pressures from the depreciation of the real. We think our stronger credits, investment grade credits, they should have, they have the stronger fundamentals. They're more likely having less pressure on their financing needs, kind of by definition of where their rating is. But certainly the pressures on the real can weigh on some of their metrics, but that doesn't necessarily mean there would be a downgrade in their rating. When you're talking the ratings in the low spec grade category, that's where you're going to be more precarious and kind of a base case that they could be more affected by real depreciation that they haven't hedged, what have you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I'll throw open to the panel the other two questions. One on the scenario for defense cooperation, and then the question on Brazil-China. Raul.
I'd like to answer the Brazil-China. I think, there is a marriage of convenience among Brazil and China and Russia and other countries, because I think it's taking too long to the rich countries admit that the current international architecture is outdated. So, to have a bigger say, all these countries join together, and they're extremely different among them, but in a way, it helps China, it helps Brazil, it helps Russia and South Africa and India to be in that club. But for sure, the slowdown of the Chinese economy, it forces Brazil, especially in a moment of economic stagnation, to look to other sides. The problem is returning to the beginning of the conversation. You need to have a very powerful Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do that stretch. So you can open dozens of embassies in Africa, or you can have an embassy in India, but without the resources, the changes don't come. So in a way, I think the government now is forced to look for other options, but you need to change policy. But I don't see any change in the way how Brazil is getting more distant of China or of Russia, because in a way, it's how they are trying to achieve a change in the international structure.
Ricardo, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I agree with Raul that there is no room for the next, I think, Dilma's term to have a new foreign policy that will include China, India, etc. I think Dilma will include in the foreign policy just the issues that are affecting directly the domestic agenda. Mm-hmm. That means negatively will be Argentina and Venezuela. It's two issues that Brazil must deal and has been dealing because it's a domestic problem in both cases. And finally, in terms of U.S., because U.S., I think, represents an opportunity for the domestic agenda very clearly. So in these three issues, I think we can expect some moves, but not in India or China, etc. In terms of the defense industry cooperation, I do think there is room for that cooperation. Brazil is in the middle of a cycle, very important cycle, after more than 10 years with not investing in defense industry. We turn back this issue in the Brazilian agenda. We are in the middle of this cycle. Of course, this cycle of investment will be affected by the current economic problem of the country, but the agenda has been reestablished, resetted, and we do still have several projects that is basically technological projects. We are talking in this sense, the Brazilian defense purchase program is basically focused on technology. It's material, it's part of this, but basically it's technology. And when you go to the international market to try to find partners for technology development, you don't find much of these partners. U.S. do have room for that. I think they are playing not that good in the last few years. I think the Europeans has been much more effective in taking these projects, but it still have room for all these remote surveillance system, both for the ocean and the frontiers. We do have a very strong agenda in terms of digital war. All this kind of intelligence spying problems, of course, after this problem with U.S., now it's a very important agenda. There is money and there is issues for that, and there is no partners yet to develop this kind of issues. Of course, you have to think that Brazil nationalist approach for this issue is a critical element. It's not possible. Brazil will not buy technology from abroad. Brazil will take a foreign partner to develop with some domestic company, both state-owned companies or private companies, this kind of solution. But I think there is room for this kind of cooperation in these next few years.
That's great. I think we have time for one last question. If there isn't one, I have a quick round for the panel. If not, okay. Yeah, second. Go over there. Can you wait for the microphone and introduce yourself quickly?
Thank you for the great presentations. My name is Susana Carrillo. I'm from the World Bank. A few months ago, there was discussion about the reform of the Brazilian Cooperation Agency and possibility of a new independent agency, which I think it's, I haven't seen any moving forward in that discussion. I don't know if you know anything about it. And linked to the points that you highlighted about the funding of the Itamaraty, I think that will be something also that will be important to address in relationship to the position of Brazil vis-a-vis the Latin America region and the cooperation with other emerging economies in Africa, India, China, etc.
Do you want to respond to that, Raul?
Yes. There has been rumors, actually, that the agency of cooperation would be taken off the Itamaraty, but so far, it's a rumor. So, there is no confirmation about it. About the changes with the relationship with Latin America, of course, there are pressures about the Mercosur architecture, how Brazil can negotiate and engage in trade talks when Argentina clearly opposes it. And that's a challenge that, any government in Brazil will have to face. So I think, so far I agree with Ricardo that, both Argentina and Venezuela are in the middle of transitions, clear transitions. So in a way, Brazil can play an important role. And I think the U.S. can use, in a very positive way, Brazil's leverage in both countries. So after so many years of people criticizing Brazil for not intervening or criticizing openly the governments of Venezuela and Argentina, now it can pay off of keeping the conversation and trying to have a positive agenda in both countries. It would be even better if Brazil had talked also with the opposition in both countries. But in a way, it's good to have an open dialogue.
Great, thanks, Raul. Well, I think that when Dilma makes her state visit to Washington later this year, we've already helped to set the agenda for what should be as part of the state visit. Whether it's commerce and moving towards some type of tax treaty or something along those lines, whether it's innovation and technology and how to enhance cooperation in that regard, whether it's educational exchanges, which is so vital for the U.S.-Brazil relationship, and a whole slew of other factors from the financial markets to kind of the broader ways in which, as Raul was talking about the Cuba front, the U.S. and Brazil can work together regionally, despite the cutbacks at Itamaraty. So with that, I want to thank our panelists for an excellent morning conversation. If you could